Close your eyes for 3 seconds and listen to the voice running in the background of your mind. That persistent, quiet whisper telling you that you aren't ready, that people are judging you, that you're going to fail, or that you should play it safe. Where did it come from? You've tolerated that internal monologue for years, treating it as if it were a wise advisor trying to protect you. Here is the cold reality. That voice is a biological parasite. It is an automated, ancient survival algorithm running inside your central nervous system whose only objective is to keep you small, predictable, and weak. Every single time you entertain a negative thought, your brain floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline, pulling your shoulders forward, shallowing your breath, and ruining your baseline authority. You aren't just thinking a thought, you are physically poisoning your neurochemistry and broadcasting submissive vulnerability to every person in the room. Most people live their entire lives as mental host bodies, letting their irrational fears, past conditioning, and internal drama dictate their real-world outcomes. They die never knowing what they were truly capable of because they mistook evolutionary trash talk for reality. If you walk away from this right now, that parasite wins. It will continue running in the background, quietly sabotaging your ambitions, leaking your internal power, and keeping you trapped in a low-level, anxious trance. Stay right here. Over the next few minutes, we are going to expose the exact behavioral mechanics of negative self-talk, and I will hand you the cold, tactical tools to execute an immediate override and destroy negative thinking for good. The biggest mistake you can make is believing that your negative thoughts represent who you actually are. Negative thinking is a primitive biological defense mechanism. Thousands of years ago, your ancestors survived by anticipating the worst possible scenario, assuming every rustle in the bushes was a predator. That threat detection system kept human beings alive in harsh conditions. But in a modern environment, that same evolutionary programming becomes a malfunction. When your mind generates catastrophic scenarios, self-doubt, or social anxiety, it is not offering you valuable wisdom. It is simply firing off outdated survival scripts designed to keep you inside a safe, low-leverage bubble. If you treat these thoughts as objective reality, you surrender your mind to a biological relic that values safety over achievement and comfort over greatness. Your brain is a chemical processing plant that easily gets addicted to its own internal drama. Every time you indulge in a spiral of negative thinking, worry, or self-pity, your brain releases a specific cocktail of stress hormones. Over time, your neural pathways adapt to this elevated level of anxiety, establishing it as your normal emotional baseline. Your subconscious mind will then actively look for things to worry about or invent problems out of thin air, simply to satisfy that familiar chemical fix. You must recognize this pattern for what it is, a neurochemical feedback loop. When a negative thought arises, understand that your brain is seeking a cheap, familiar hit of stress. Refuse to give it the satisfaction. Starve the loop by withholding your attention. You cannot harbor negative self-talk on the inside without it leaking onto the outside. Observe what happens to your physical body when you entertain a thought of self-doubt or fear. Your posture immediately softens, your chest collapses inward, your eyes begin to dart erratically, and your vocal cadence loses its deep, grounded resonance. You become physically smaller, broadcasting microsignals of submission and internal instability. People around you pick up on these nonverbal cues instantaneously at a subconscious level. They lose confidence in your authority, question your capability, and sense your hesitation, all because you allowed a negative thought to hijack your physical frame. To command respect and hold space in any environment, you must eliminate the internal noise that ruins your physical presence. You cannot argue with an emotional, hyperactive brain using logic. When you try to debate a negative thought, you are still engaging with it, giving it bandwidth and power. You must execute a cold, mechanical, somatic interrupt. The second a negative thought pattern attempts to lock into your mind, abruptly break your physical state. Stand up, pull your shoulders back with force, root your feet into the floor, freeze your gaze on a single point, and exhale completely. By taking immediate, aggressive command of your physical hardware, you instantly disrupt the neural firing pattern generating the negative thought. You cut off the physiological feedback loop, forcing your central nervous system out of a defensive posture and back into an authoritative baseline. Replace your emotional self-talk with cold, operational directives. When a negative thought enters your field of awareness, such as, "This is going to fail," or "I can't handle this pressure," do not panic and do not validate it. Treat it like a pop-up ad on a computer screen. Identify it instantly. That is an automated threat detection script. Then, overwrite it with an absolute high-authority command. Shift your focus away from how you feel and lock it onto what needs to be executed right now. Ask yourself one question. What is the single highest leverage physical action I must take in this exact second? Then execute it without debate, hesitation, or emotional fluff. The time for letting your primitive brain run your trajectory is permanently over. You are not the victim of your thoughts. You are the sovereign commander of your attention. Every second you spend entertaining internal doubt, dwelling on past mistakes, or dreading hypothetical futures is a direct theft of your finite life force. Decide today to wage war on low-level thinking. Intercept every leak, shut down every chemical spiral, hold your posture with absolute authority, and operate with cold, relentless clarity until negative thinking has no space left to survive. The biological deception of negative bias represents an ancient evolutionary programming mechanism that actively undermines your modern capability and long-term trajectory. Human psychology is naturally slanted toward threat detection because our survival once depended on hypervigilance toward potential danger. In a primitive environment, anticipating the worst-case scenario kept your ancestors alive, conditioning the human central nervous system to treat every unknown variable as a life-threatening risk. However, in the modern world, this hyper-reactive survival algorithm functions as an outdated software glitch. When your mind generates catastrophic predictions, internal criticism, or intense self-doubt, it is not offering you profound strategic wisdom or accurate self-assessment. It is simply firing off ancient automated survival scripts designed to keep you cautious, manageable, and physically safe within a low-leverage comfort zone. Treating these biological threat responses as objective truth is one of the most destructive mistakes you can make in your personal development. The human mind frequently misinterprets evolutionary anxiety as intuition or realistic planning, allowing irrational fears to dictate major life decisions. When you entertain negative self-talk, you are giving weight to an internal defense system that values short-term emotional safety over high-level achievement, growth, and real-world impact. This bias actively distorts your perception of reality, magnifying minor obstacles while blinding you to massive strategic opportunities. By taking these low-level biological signals seriously, you effectively surrender your cognitive authority to an evolutionary relic that seeks to minimize your exposure to friction, leaving your true potential completely unexecuted. Furthermore, this continuous threat detection loop places immense biological stress on your physiological system, generating a state of chronic, low-grade panic. Every time you allow a negative thought to take root, your brain triggers a release of stress hormones, heightening your heart rate and fragmenting your focus. Your nervous system enters a submissive, defensive posture aimed at self-preservation rather than proactive execution. This constant neurochemical drain degrades your decision-making capacity, leaving you mentally exhausted before you have even begun high-leverage labor. You become trapped in a state of hypervigilant paralysis, where the mere thought of taking a risk, holding an assertive boundary, or stepping into a high-stakes environment feels like an insurmountable threat to your survival. Recognizing the biological deception behind negative bias is the essential first step toward reclaiming total command over your mental baseline. You must train yourself to view negative self-talk with cold, clinical detachment rather than emotional compliance. When thoughts of inadequacy, fear, or hesitation arise, observe them as automated biological outputs rather than reflections of your actual capability or reality. You do not argue with a primitive instinct, nor do you validate its presence. You simply label it as obsolete environmental feedback. By stripping negative thoughts of their perceived authority, you break the hypnotic trance of evolutionary self-protection and restore your central nervous system to a clear, objective state. Decoupling your identity from your evolutionary survival mechanisms allows you to execute decisions from a position of absolute internal sovereignty. You stop allowing automated threat responses to set the boundaries of your ambition, recognizing that true progress always exists on the other side of initial biological friction. Instead of letting low-level anxiety dictate your choices, you operate with deliberate, cold, calculated strategy, prioritizing high-value objectives over cheap emotional comfort. You systematically override the primitive urge to hide, play safe, or downsize your goals, transforming your mind from a reactive threat detector into an unyielding instrument of strategic, real-world performance. The subconscious micro-leaking of internal doubt is the physical, nonverbal transmission of your psychological state directly into your surrounding environment. Human beings are constantly broadcasting their internal standards, confidence levels, and self-assessments through thousands of subtle physical signals every single day. When you harbor unchecked negative self-talk, self-doubt, or hidden feelings of inadequacy, it is biologically impossible to keep those thoughts completely contained within your mind. Your central nervous system naturally translates your internal mental baseline into your physical hardware, resulting in micro-behavioral leaks that subtly signal submissive vulnerability, hesitation, and low authority to every person around you. These micro-leaks manifest in distinct, highly observable physical behaviors that instantly alter how others perceive and interact with you. The moment internal doubt takes hold, your baseline posture softens and your spine subtly collapses inward as your body instinctively tries to make itself smaller and less noticeable. Your eye movements become erratic, quick, and unsettled, reflecting an internal need to scan your environment for reassurance or escape routes. Your vocal cadence loses its deep, grounded resonance, shifting into a higher, more hesitant pitch, characterized by frequent pauses, filler words, or quiet qualifiers. Even your physical gestures become nervous and fidgety as your hands reach for ambient objects, fix your clothing, or touch your neck to relieve the internal physiological tension caused by your negative self-talk. Furthermore, this continuous micro-leaking creates a destructive feedback loop between your body and your brain, reinforcing the very negative thoughts that cause the physical leaks in the first place. When your brain registers your collapsed posture, shallow breathing, and erratic eye movements, it interprets those physical cues as absolute confirmation that you are indeed in danger or out of your depth. It responds by flooding your system with additional stress hormones, deepening your anxiety and generating even more negative internal dialogue. This physiological feedback loop traps you in a self-fulfilling cycle of submissive behavior, where your negative thoughts fuel weak body language, and your weak body language continually validates your negative thoughts. Breaking this cycle requires an absolute zero-tolerance policy toward unexamined internal doubt and its nonverbal expressions. You must cultivate sharp, clinical self-awareness, learning to catch and correct physical micro-leaks the exact millisecond they manifest in your frame. When you detect your shoulders rolling forward or your gaze dropping, you must execute an immediate physical correction, restoring your posture, steadying your breath, and freezing unnecessary movement. By aggressively controlling your nonverbal output, you sever the link between internal doubt and outward vulnerability, forcing your nervous system back into an authoritative alignment. The neurochemical addiction to inner drama is an insidious biological phenomenon where your central nervous system becomes dependent on the recurring spikes of stress, anxiety, and self-pity generated by negative thinking. The human brain functions as a complex chemical factory, constantly releasing neurotransmitters and hormones based on your internal thoughts and environmental perceptions. When you consistently indulge in spirals of worry, self-doubt, or victimhood, your brain releases a potent cocktail of cortisol and adrenaline. Over time, your neural pathways adapt to this elevated level of internal friction, establishing it as your default emotional baseline. Your brain becomes physically accustomed to operating in a state of continuous, low-grade crisis, viewing peace, quiet focus, and mental stillness as unnatural states that must be immediately corrected. Once this neurochemical addiction takes hold, your subconscious mind begins actively seeking out, or deliberately inventing, reasons to feel anxious, offended, or overwhelmed. Whenever your life approaches a period of stability or high-level calm, your addicted nervous system experiences a form of chemical withdrawal. To satisfy its craving for familiar stress hormones, your brain will pull past failures out of memory, manufacture hypothetical future disasters, or catastrophize minor everyday inconveniences. You find yourself picking unnecessary fights, obsessing over irrelevant social microslights, or procrastinating on important tasks until the last minute, just to create the high-stress environment your biology craves. You mistake this constant internal turbulence for emotional depth or realistic problem-solving, failing to realize you are simply feeding a biological habit. This addiction creates an immense, continuous drain on your cognitive bandwidth, trapping your executive functions in a state of perpetual, low-leverage labor. Instead of directing your neural energy toward high-value strategic planning, deep work, or mastering your environment, your brain burns through massive amounts of glucose and mental stamina, maintaining its internal drama loops. You end your days feeling physically drained and mentally exhausted, despite having accomplished very little real-world progress. This constant expenditure of energy on imaginary threats creates a profound sense of fatigue, making the prospect of taking disciplined, high-stakes action feel completely overwhelming to your depleted system. Immediate somatic interrupts are the definitive physiological intervention required to abruptly sever an active negative feedback loop and restore your central nervous system to an authoritative baseline. When a wave of self-doubt, anxiety, or catastrophic thinking takes hold, most people attempt to fight it using rational thought, internal debate, or positive affirmations. In behavioral mechanics, this approach is fundamentally flawed because the brain's emotional and threat detection centers operate far faster than the logical cortex. Attempting to reason with a hyperactive, stress-flooded nervous system is like trying to put out a fire by arguing with the flames. Engagement only feeds the loop, granting the negative thought additional bandwidth, cognitive energy, and psychological power over your immediate state. To break a negative mental spiral instantly, you must bypass the analytical mind entirely and execute a sharp physical command directly on your biological hardware. Your mental state is inextricably tethered to your physical posture, breathing depth, muscle tension, and visual focus. When you entertain negative thoughts, your body automatically adopts a submissive physical signature. Your shoulders roll forward, your chest contracts, your breathing becomes shallow and thoracic, and your eyes begin to dart erratically across your surroundings. This physical state sends continuous neural feedback to your brain, confirming that you are under threat and perpetuating the release of stress hormones. A somatic interrupt forcefully shatters this feedback loop by imposing an immediate, non-negotiable physical state of total operational readiness. Executing an effective somatic interrupt requires an aggressive, highly deliberate physical reset, the exact millisecond you detect a negative thought pattern attempting to take root. You abruptly break your current physical posture without hesitation. Stand up or straighten your spine with sudden, sharp force, pulling your shoulders back and down to open your chest cavity. Anchor your feet firmly flat against the floor to establish a grounded, unwavering physical base. Simultaneously, freeze your visual focus onto a single, stationary point in space, completely stopping the erratic eye movements that accompany internal anxiety. Finally, force a deep, controlled diaphragmatic breath, filling your lower abdomen and extending your exhale to instantly activate the vagus nerve and downregulate your central nervous system. Cold tactical cognitive reframing is the systematic process of stripping emotional weight from your internal monologue and replacing passive threat responses with clear, non-negotiable operational directives. Most individuals treat their internal self-talk as an accurate reflection of truth, allowing subjective feelings, passing doubts, and ancient evolutionary fears to dictate their choices. When a negative thought enters their mind, they engage with it, validate it, and allow it to distort their perception of what is possible. Tactical cognitive reframing requires you to abandon this submissive posture, step back from your internal narrative, and view your thoughts through a lens of cold, clinical detachment. You stop treating your mind as a sacred oracle and begin managing it as an information system that requires constant filtering, cleaning, and recalibration. The core mechanism of tactical reframing relies on instantaneous, unemotional identification. The second a negative thought surfaces, whether it is a fear of failure, an impulse to procrastinate, or an unsettling feeling of social inadequacy, you do not panic, nor do you try to soothe yourself with hollow affirmations. Instead, you instantly classify the thought as raw, unrefined data. You label it with objective precision. This is an automated threat detection response, or this is a neurochemical stress-seeking mechanism. By assigning a clinical label to the thought, you create immediate psychological distance between your core identity and your brain's biological noise. You recognize that the presence of a thought does not require your compliance, nor does it demand an emotional reaction from your central nervous system. Once you have isolated the negative input, you execute an immediate cognitive override by installing an operational directive in its place. You do not ask yourself how you feel about a situation, because how you feel is entirely irrelevant to what must be executed. You shift your internal query from, "Why am I feeling this way?" to, "What is the single highest leverage action required in this exact second?" This shift moves your brain out of its passive threat analysis state and forces your executive functions back online. You replace abstract, emotionally charged worries with concrete physical commands. Straighten the spine, adjust the vocal resonance, initiate the primary task, maintain absolute eye focus. You treat your mind as a tactical instrument that operates on clear, explicit code rather than vague emotional impulses. This relentless reframing process completely alters your relationship with internal discomfort, transforming perceived obstacles into immediate triggers for aggressive execution. When your brain attempts to highlight the friction, difficulty, or potential embarrassment of a task, you reframe that exact friction as proof that you are operating at the edge of your baseline capabilities. Discomfort is no longer interpreted as a signal to retreat or seek safety. It is reclassified as the essential biological cost of building high-level authority and operational capability. You actively train your mind to associate internal resistance with an immediate demand for forward momentum, ensuring that the urge to shrink back automatically triggers a sharp, unapologetic advance. By mastering cold, tactical cognitive reframing, you establish an impenetrable, sovereign baseline over your mental environment. You stop allowing automated survival scripts, submissive social conditioning, and cheap emotional drama to sabotage your daily output and real-world trajectory. Your internal space becomes quiet, precise, and completely aligned with your strategic objectives, free from the diluting effects of unchecked self-doubt. You move through your environment with absolute internal certainty, knowing that no matter what thoughts or feelings surface within your mind, you possess the cold, mechanical discipline to strip them of their power and execute with unyielding authority.